for children's mental health. I also am from Georgetown, where I lead a couple of other early childhood focused centers, Center of Excellence for Infant and Early Childhood Mental Health Consultation, the Head Start, National Center for Health, Behavioral Health and Safety, and then work on the McVie, TARC, and a couple of other centers. So we're really excited, and I will get started with a little show and tell, but again, please use the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're from, maybe as a start. I don't know if you've ever done that on a Zoom. I came up with it. So trademark Neil for entering your name and what you do. If you use it somewhere else on a Zoom, just give me credit. I'd really appreciate it. So I will start with way more slides than you ever thought you were interested in seeing. And then you'll realize, I don't really want to see any of them. But the way that I like to talk about early childhood systems is in some sort of parallel way, meaning I think sometimes we talk about early childhood systems or just system of care in a way, and people are like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So I always like to have like a little parallel process. We're all early childhood folks here, so I like to do it that way, if that's okay. And so I'm going to talk about Frederick Olmsted, because I think that's mostly what's been in the news. I think there's some COVID thing going on, but also Frederick Olmsted seems to be dominating the news cycle these days. Who is Frederick Olmsted? Well, you're just going to have to wait. So, of course, SAMHSA wants to disclaim me as much as possible. So they actually have a disclaimer slide that says anything I say has nothing to do with SAMHSA. I'm just joking. We're just trying to make sure that you understand that this is part of our work. You've seen this before. So I want to talk a little bit quickly about our center. So some of you may be very familiar. You've come to other things. You're looking at our 5 Things Digest. You're coming to other webinars. You know that we have folks who are specializing in family-driven care and youth-driven care, who are putting out all kinds of resources. We have a great group of partners on all of this. And if you're interested in this, we have a website that we'll share at the end, and really encourage you to go look at that. This is really, for us, everything we do is related to these goals. So it puts a lot of pressure on me to actually make sure that we're actually talking about this today. But it really is about all children, youth, young adults, and families with or at risk. And certainly when we talk about early childhood, we oftentimes are talking about children and families who are at risk, who may not have a diagnosed condition, who may not actually be accessing multiple parts of the system, or they may. And so we always like to include all of those in our goal. We have a lot of audiences, and certainly for an early childhood talk, we think about all the kinds of different audiences that we oftentimes are thinking about in this work, and I'll get into that in a bit here. And this is just a few of the kinds of things that we do. There'll be a quiz at the end to see who remembers this in order, like the old Simon game that some of us played. But you can see we have communities of practice that the early childhood team will be leading. We have coaching, we have training and technical assistance, all kinds of opportunities for folks. Today's presenter comes to us, oh no, it's just me. Okay, so we'll keep moving. So I said Frederick Olmsted. And so when folks hear that, I always wonder, do folks know who this is? And I'm fascinated with Frederick Olmsted because I have no visual spatial skills, and Frederick Olmsted certainly did, because he designed Central Park in New York City. And again, that completely alienates almost everybody on a webinar, because they're like, oh, great, New York, we should talk about that more. But the point of this is to talk about systems development and an early childhood system in your state or in a tribal nation, your territory, your community, and think about what he was doing when they started developing a park that at that point was nothing. There was nothing there, and they turned it into a big, gigantic park that looks like this in the middle of a city. And why is that important? Because what they did is they took this sort of plot of land and reshaped it. And that's what you do when you build a system, is you start to reshape what exists. Some things stay the same, and you work around that, and you keep those sort of facets. And other things need to change. And so I'll talk about that a little bit today. The truth is whether you're building Central Park, you're doing the pyramid model, you're building a system, it's all about what you do, each of you, in sort of your role and your capacity as part of that system. And it's really important to understand that, because I think oftentimes we talk about this like, oh yeah, what do leaders, it's everyone. It's every single family member. It's every single caregiver. It's every single person who's operating in that system because you're trying to help a child. I've somehow not ruined completely this one. This one's 5 now. This is my youngest. This is Isabella. And I always think about when we talk about systems, we sometimes get so far away from the fact that we're trying to help a child and a family in some way, shape, or form. So I always like to have a little reminder that at some point, this baby is going to need that system to really support them. It may be in a very sort of general way where they're going for their well child checkup with their primary care doc. It may be in more intense ways when they're working with Part C or with behavioral health folks. All of those are just part of that system. And I really want to help people understand that approach, understand these different aspects and how they fit into your system. And we're hoping that you all learn what's most helpful for you. So some of you are veterans. I see some of my friends here who I've worked with over the years, and all of us sort of know what work you've been doing. And other new folks who are like, yeah, we're just trying to figure this out. And so whether you have a system of care grant, an early childhood comprehensive systems grant, a project launch grant, an indigenous project launch grant, you have a tribal McVie grant, or maybe you have no grant, you're just trying to figure this out. Trying to figure out what's most helpful for you is really our goal here. So when we think about building a system, we think about the groundwork. What is it that we need to do in terms of policy, in terms of collaboration? What's the workforce that we need to be thinking about? Who is it that's going to serve, and to what end are those people serving our system? What's the infrastructure we need to build, and how do we sustain all of that? It's no different than when they built Central Park. They had to think about how do they shape that ground, who's going to do it, how do they build infrastructure that allows that to be a sustainable sort of place. And this systems approach is really critical to be thinking about a lot of different aspects of a system at the same time. Because this is what the public health system for mental health looks like in some ways. This is from friends of mine in Missouri that I work with who shared this once, and I was like, this is great, because in some ways, I assume that family members could tell me this is what it feels like, is to try and get through the systems. I'm trying to jump from ball to ball and no one's helping. And sometimes there's not something in between and you're taking a leap of faith. But these are the kinds of things, whether you sort of see this as a Bronfenbrenner sort of approach or just this sort of mishmash of lines, systems are really complex. And an early childhood system is really complex because it's so dependent on the rest of the systems that are being developed for older children and for the adults, right? We don't talk about an infant. I know my infant mental health friends get excited when we say we don't talk about a baby except in the context of their caregiver. But the truth is we don't talk about a baby and just say, well, hopefully we'll figure out what to do for that baby. We say, what are we going to do for that family? And what if that family is experiencing substance use difficulties? How are we connecting our adult serving system with our early childhood system? So this is really complex, and it's not so easy to just sort of be like, okay, I get it. I think we've got this figured out. It's more about, do you even know who all the players are in your system? Could you even identify that for yourselves? Who everybody is in this? And this is not an exhaustive list. And this is usually in the point at which somebody's like, wait, I don't understand what this guy's talking about at all. So I'll just see if there's any participants left besides my mom. Yeah, okay, we're good. No, my mom dropped off. Okay. We are talking about an early childhood system. So this is what we'd like you to think about, is that in an early childhood system, we spend a lot more time in some ways talking about promotion and prevention than we do about the treatment end of things. We spend time talking about treatment because there are young children and infants and their families who may need treatment. There's a whole lot more folks who need the promotion prevention. And all of these building blocks around planning and procedures and interagency partnership, all these sorts of things that you see there in blue or purple, I don't really know my colors, those are really not dissimilar from any sort of system that we've ever talked about. And then we sort of see those as supporting parents and childcare providers, services for families, services for children, all in the context of supporting social emotional development. This is an older slide, so wording wise, it's not really family voice. Obviously, it's about being family driven. And what you see missing here that really is a component is, what does it mean to be youth driven? in an early childhood system, right? We don't necessarily, you have to admit Dallas, Carrie, Dallas is important to admit. So what does it look like? And quite honestly, we've had lots of conversations about what family-driven care looks like and what youth-guided care, youth-driven care looks like in an early childhood system, because sometimes it may look a little bit different. We have families who may not have a lot of experience, who maybe have just interacted with their pediatrician and are super satisfied, and they don't know why they'd want to talk about a system. So here's what's similar when we talk about an early childhood system. All of the pieces that you think about, the core system of care values, addressing equity and racism and understanding, being culturally driven, how we sort of provide those services and things like that. But what's different is we have to think about those partnership strategies. What does it mean for a pediatrician to be our collaborator in this? The diagnostic issues are very challenging because folks want to use a diagnostic system like the DC-05, 0 to 5, when we can't necessarily build directly from the DC 0 to 5. We have to use crosswalks and things like that. How do we address youth involvement? We don't have 2-year-olds sitting around a table saying, this is what we want the system to look like. And it's not to be facetious, it's to start to think really about what do we want the system to look like. So it's her birthday. So I tried to put a picture of Maria Jose in here with one of our nephews from a while back. She's only 23, so I'm super excited that I could find a picture. But when we talk about those services and systems, it is important to understand there are lots of evidence-based practices for young children and their families. 15 years ago, if I would do this talk, you wouldn't hear that. You would not hear the same sort of thing. You'd be like, well, there's a couple of things. And I just think it's important to understand the early childhood field has advanced so far over the last 20 years, almost in parallel to some of the gains that we've experienced in the overall system of care work. And I understand I'm moving quickly because I want to make sure that, it's a coffee talk, not a coffee lecture. And I've had a lot of coffee. So, I think in terms of financing, even this, I'm not sure that I would say that, one, it's not exhaustive, but two, it shifted. I made this slide like a week ago, and quite honestly, now I would talk about childcare dollars all the time. And I would be best friends with my childcare folks in my community, in my state, in my tribal nation, because they have a lot of money that's come in that really is about addressing social emotional development. Head Start, a lot of money coming in to address trauma. McVie, a lot of money, like all of these sort of partners, there's this great opportunity. And part of the reason that I'm saying all those things is because we don't have a federal funding stream that's just like, this is for early childhood. It's early childhood advocates fighting constantly to get folks to understand, to sort of Evelyn's point, that we know when we see a 20-year-old who's in the justice system, we probably could have told you when they were 3. In fact, I know that because we used to do an exercise where we talk about a forensic report on a 17-year-old who was in juvenile detention, who at 3 years old was already having difficulty. And had we sort of just intervened and stayed on it, we could have done, as Jeffrey Canada from the Harlem Children's Zone talks about, you can spend $5,000 a year now or $125,000 down the line to incarcerate somebody. Why? Why, knowing the return on investment, will we not do those sorts of things? So I'm really glad to see Evelyn's point there in the chat. Same, in terms of financing, that these block grant dollars that come into states tend to get gobbled up by adults. And I'm not anyone who would say that adults don't deserve support. But by the time we get to the point where we're like, okay, so how much is left for very young children? It's usually not so much. So I'd encourage folks to be looking in the Recovery Act. There's a great, I think now I can't remember, maybe it was 0 to 3, sent around the best explanation around all the things that apply to young children. I'll find it and I'll get it out to folks. No idea how, just over-promising and under-delivering is sort of my style. When we talk about sort of systems development, we talk about having a strategic plan, implementation of a model. So is it about mental health consultation? Is it about the pyramid model? Is it about a particular EBP? And what's the workforce that's going to support whatever we're trying to do? So oftentimes we get asked this question around, well, what should we do? Should we do the incredible year? Should we do that? I'm like, They're all great things. All of these are great evidence-based practices. What's going to work for your children in your community, given who they are and what would be most helpful, and how you're going to pay for it? And that's sort of parallel to how they started to design this plan to sort of shift all the greenery that was existing in Central Park to turn it into what it looks like now. And to start to think about for individuals, right? I always go back to that picture of Isabella, but also at sort of a systematic or at a systemic or a programmatic level. What does that mean for you is what I want you to think about. So as you start to think about these little circulation systems for pedestrians and horseback riders, you also should be thinking about from a public health approach, how do we choose the right intervention? How do we evaluate that and show the return on investment so that we actually understand why, when we go to the legislature, say we need more money. Yeah, thanks, Pamela. We have evidence, right? So in Maryland, when they did pilot studies of infant and early childhood mental health consultation, they took the outcome data and they also had families who were willing to testify. I think Jane's on, Jane could talk about this, to sort of say, this works. We know this works. It reduces expulsion and suspension from early care and education. Having that kind of evaluation data is what really drives the financing of these early childhood systems. All right, so let me finish up so we can have some time to talk. So I want you to start to think about, how have you been implementing evidence-based practices? What challenges do you have? Workforce, I'm going to guess, is one of the big issues, that you just don't have enough people to do the work. And then where are things like the pyramid model that we know is in at least 30 states, the standards that the Alliance for the Advancement of Infant Mental Health have created? Where's mental health consultation in your state, in your tribe, in your territory, in your community? And then how do you start to develop those relationships, cultivate those leaders, have those champions, and withstand the political winds that sort of shift in those places across the country where we've seen more success in terms of early childhood system? It's been places where it doesn't matter whether it's a Republican or Democratic leadership in that place. It doesn't matter who's in charge of tribal council, because people believe in sort of the development of the system as they've envisioned it, and they keep moving it forward. So these are the kinds of things that you need. You need that competent workforce. You need these EBPs and those that are defined by the community. So evidence-based practices, practice-based evidence, what works for you, and how you sort of continue to develop evaluation methodology to ensure that you have good outcome data to show to those folks who are more than willing to cut programs for young children in times of crisis and economic downturns. This is stuff you've heard 1,000 times. You know, there's no endpoint. I've yet to see a fully formed system that's done that has no work to do. I've seen there's a continuum, but you got to start to think about that sustainability. What are we going to do? How are we going to pay for things? How are we going to support our workforce? How are we going to evaluate these things? How are we going to have champions at a state level? How are we going to partner? There was a project officer at SAMHSA who used to tell this great story. She was a family leader in a state, and she and the behavioral health lead for the state, so it was a state person and a family advocate, had an agreement. They would never say something in public about the other person without telling them before. So they would always have a conversation. They might say things like, I totally disagree with what they're saying, but they knew that it was coming. And that's that important kind of relationship that we can sort of cultivate in systems. And we'll get to those slides to Kiki's. Anytime somebody says something nice about me, I'll make sure you get whatever you want. So you can have, we'll make sure you get the slides. So it's a long journey, right? You always have to sort of take that long view, that just like I'm sitting here with Isabella, my dad was sitting here with me, apparently dressing me in short sleeve corduroy outfits back in the 70s. But you got to sort of take that long view that building a system takes a really long time, and it has lots of ups and downs, and they didn't just turn something into a park. You don't just turn it into a system overnight. So I'm going to stop sharing so we can sort of talk, because I know there's been good chat. And I don't know if other folks on the team want to sort of throw out, we should start here, or if folks have particular questions. Carrie, they can unmute if folks want to talk. There we go. All right, so there's a couple of things in the chat. I'm going to mangle your name, Tihen, so please I apologize in advance. So my concern with some evidence-based interventions is that they lack cultural flexibilities and may not consider how trauma impacts children very differently. There's a gap in supports to caregivers, often also dealing with trauma, which means a dollar should be considered not for youth only or adults only, but creatively. Yeah, so I love this point around around the idea that lots of evidence-based practices, they've also, I'm not sure that every single evidence-based practice has been shown to be effective with every single community across the country. So how do we as a community, as a tribal nation, territory, state, how do we start to determine what's most effective? You know, in Washington state, they have, or at least used to, maybe they stopped at some point, but what they used to do is if they were considering an evidence-based practice, they had a group that would do essentially a return on investment analysis to say, this is worthy of our state investing money in this particular practice. I think it's those kinds of things. So everybody likes to run around and talk about evidence-based practices. I don't know. I'm a child psychologist. I had a mom one way back in the day, but she's like, I'm going to put my kids on blue-green algae because that's what's going to help them with ADHD. And I'm like, okay, have you talked to your doctor about it? Yeah. Is it going to be harmful? No, I don't know. I have no idea if algae is, and somebody will correct me. But I would never be one to say, don't try it. Parents trying to help their child. I just think like we have to be thinking, if there's anything that early childhood is about, it's about being flexible when we work with children and families and thinking outside the box and understanding that, you know, I remember distinctly running around a playground and a director of a Head Start being like, what are you doing? And I'm like, I'm doing an intervention. I'm doing social skills. She's like, why aren't you up in your office? I'm like, I don't know. The 2-year-old doesn't lay on the couch and tell me about their dreams. Like, this is silly. Like, this is what it is. So I think being flexible, to your point, is really important. Flexible like Gumby. That's a good current reference, Dallas, and maybe like 6 of us actually understand. But I love it, Dallas, right? Like being really flexible is critical. I can say that to Dallas because I know that. That's really good. Okay, other thoughts. My God. Other thoughts about this or about communities of practice or things that would be helpful. This is your early childhood world for this center. What are going to be things that you're looking for that would be helpful? Do you want more presenting like me, people like me blathering on? Do you want other things? What kinds of things would be most helpful for all of you?
I think it is, well, I think all of this is super helpful. I think if we were all speaking the same language or similar language, regardless of where we are, that might be helpful in terms of getting funding, because I feel like people are willing to fund us, but they're not early childhood experts necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
So they hear these great stories and it's not necessarily going to, now I'm being self-serving, where we think are the best people to share that. Any thoughts there?
So let's start with Ellen, where are you from?
New Jersey.
I know that. I want everybody else to know that. Good to see you. So, I think part of this is, what do the partnerships look like? Are people who are the early childhood experts sitting at the tables that we want them to sit at? Oftentimes we're sitting, quite frankly, at the kids' table, right? And somebody's saying, listen, we're talking about big boy stuff here, the adult stuff about block grants. We'll get back to you on, when in fact, early childhood folks, and this is what I love, Jane Walker's on the phone, and Jane and others really have started sort of a family network focused on early childhood. So folks who really are advocating for the early childhood kinds of things. And I think, Ellen, to your point, it's when folks are sitting in decision-making bodies, whatever that might be at whatever level, at a tribal or state or territorial community level, how do we ensure that there are also people sitting there who do know early childhood? And who are those people? I sort of have this little dream that in every state there's going to be an early childhood TA center, and there's going to be a point person for all things early childhood who actually understands system of care, so that they're not like, I know early childhood, but they don't understand what it means to be family driven. And quite frankly, it's silly because we started with IFSPs way before anybody figured out that family should be driving the process, but you get the point. So I think, Ellen, my thought, and I'd be happy to hear other folks, is I think we got to figure out what's the table where those decisions are getting made and who's sitting at it and how do we get there. All right, Pamela's already given me the hook, like, we got to get out of here. You got to finish up. Let's get this idiot off the stage and figure out what we're doing next.
Hey,
But there are,
Neil,
yes.
this is Dallas. So one of the
Sorry,
things.
Dallas, I'm not taking any questions. I'm just joking.
This isn't the question.
Oh, okay.
It's an idea. So
Yeah.
we have the centers of excellence, right, where we can go to for all of our resources. And it has been really great. And I love, love, love that you've updated the foundations of consultation. Again, I just visited it yesterday. I really like, we've always used that information as we've trained our consultants, and that has just made where you are now with that has just made it so much easier for us. But what I wanted to say, the idea is what would it take, or could each state have their own centers of excellence where we're the ones coming to you guys and we're getting our resources, but we're able to have some type of I don't know, something like a centers of excellence or a system of excellence or something like that in our own state, where we're able to be recognized as being connected to you guys, so that it gives us some type of what's the word I'm looking for? Credibility.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's way more expertise within each state, job, and territory than there ever is at a federal center that's so far removed in some ways. And as much as many of us can talk with some degree of expertise about all the places we visited and spent time with, I don't actually know Alabama all that well. I don't know Arkansas all that well. I know the things that I've learned from other people. I think the expertise always sort of lies there. How do you fund that? How do you get folks to sort of see the value in that? It's a good question. I mean, I certainly think that there are ways in which we've seen that sort of spread in terms of like the endorsements or the pyramid model or other things that are sort of, each state has some expertise. But I do like the idea of sort of trying to think through as a group, and to Julia, Pamela, Jane, Caitlin, Joanna, and folks on our early childhood team, it'll be interesting to start to think about how we might support the development of sort of the unique centers like Dallas describes. All right, so we've got a minute. So yeah, maybe 30 minutes is not, 30 minutes. I always like 30 minutes because then you leave and you go somewhere else. Carrie, I have a question though about evaluation. Do we want folks are evaluating this in some way? I mean, I gave myself a 5, so I think we're all, no, everybody else has to say something too. That's all right.
Yes. I put the link in the chat box just so y'all can see
link
it.
in the chat box. And for those who didn't see, it might have gone by. Pamela put in, there's a whole slew of these kinds of coffee talks that will have lots of different folks showing up on. We'll have our communities of practice starting. So we have a whole host of other things. Go to the website, which, Carrie, can you put the website in there for folks before we all hop off for the NTAC website? Good point by Kimberly around Help Me Grow. And I do think, to Lori's point, getting the universities and higher ed's really, really critical. University of Maryland, the School of Social Work, the Innovation Center that had this TA center, I thought did an incredible job of pulling universities in to talk about, can we develop common curricula around how we talk about early childhood systems or how we talk about different kinds of systems. If we're all training social workers, how do we do this in a way that people sort of get trained the same way? So I think it's a great point, Carrie. Lori, sorry, I saw Carrie put the NTAC website in there. So not going to keep you longer. Coffee's getting cold. Folks, hopefully this was sort of a format that works for you, half hour. If you have other questions, please come talk to us. We have a form if you want actual TA, you want members of our team to actually work with you on any of the things that you're like, I'm really struggling with this. I want folks who really understand youth-driven services to come help me. I really don't understand practice-based evidence and tribal community. Just let us know what we can do to be helpful. There's a button there to sort of click on and say, I want some TA. So yes, agreed to Lori. All right, thanks everybody. Have a good rest of the day.